Thank you for having me. I'm going to try to give you some examples of some work that I've done that give perhaps some suggestions and ideas of how these topics we've been talking about can be manifested in practical applications of immigrants involved in artistic life. I come from Arizona. It's probably right now one of the most hostile environments for immigrants in the United States. And it's a real battlefront. It's a very difficult situation. And we still manage to do some amazing things, even in the most xenophobic and racist legislature in the United States at this moment. We managed to do that primarily in where I live in Tucson, through the means of a festival, a folk life festival. It's a long tradition in the United States. It started in the early 20th centuries in Philadelphia, actually, bringing together ethnic communities, migrant communities. At that time, they were Dutch Germans. In the notion of a folk life festival as an umbrella where people can gather. I translated our funny name for you. Did I move it? Oh, I forgot to move. So that was my slide. I'm looking at my slides and forgot. We have a funny name for this festival, Tucson Meet Yourself, and I translated that for you and the mission statement in French. And you can see there what the mission statement looks like of an organization exclusively devoted to working with folk and ethnic communities. And we also add everyday expressions of cultural life, because that includes things like gardening and cooking and sewing and that sort of activity that goes under the radar. But unfortunately, I'm not here to talk about Tucson Meet Yourself too much. I have other things to talk to you about, but these are just some of the possibilities that exist, people representing themselves. We bring in this festival in Tucson 65 different communities, ethnic groups. 100,000 people come and participate, dance, music, folk arts, food. And I could give a whole half-hour or 2-hour presentation on the politics of festivals as a vehicle of representation. They have many, many wonderful things. They have many things that are very dangerous and slippery, but they do provide an opportunity for groups to represent themselves as individual associations and clubs, and that's mostly how we do it. There are, for example, only 14 families that are from Colombia in Tucson, but they have the Colombia Club. So they come dressed in Colombian outfits and cook Colombian food and do Colombian dances with the children, and this is all repeated through all these 65 different groups from all over the world, of course. I'm sorry that I'm gonna have to be turning. I should have brought a mirror. When I'm thinking of the festival, I'm also thinking of the things that happen outside of that. And for example, the concept of the art world comes to mind, as a lot of what we've been talking about today defines a certain invention, a certain artificial field that has been created that has assumptions about who is an artist, what art can do for people, who needs art, who has art to give, how art should be funded, and where art should happen. And these assumptions represent the circuits and definitions by which we recognize art as art. And by implication, there's things that are artistic, but we don't recognize them as art because they fall outside of this criteria, this definition. Imagine, however, another system of art, parallel, underground, it's separate from that established system that's measured. When I was living in San Jose, I used to go to my sister's house to visit every Friday night, and as I was driving to her house, I would pass this hot dog stand in the corner of a neighborhood, and in the parking lot of the hot dog stand, there would be this gathering of people who fix their cars. This is a strong tradition in the Chicano movement out of Los Angeles in California, started in the 1940s. And I can assure you that most of these people gathered there never got a grant for their projects. And they were never measured in any way by any institution. They actually invested a lot of money in fixing their cars in a system that had beauty, first of all. In fact, a poet has called these kind of cars butterflies with transmission. It's a system that is self-generated, self-designated, self-fashioned, and self-authorized. It doesn't really care whether anybody in the Arts Council is paying attention or not. It just happens because there's a community that supports and believes it and invests in it from their own resources. It is, however, a system that as it flies under the radar is highly visible materially, because we're talking about cars that drive down the street, but socially is paradoxically rather invisible. And the main reason for the invisibility is that it is officially disavowed. It's not really something that arts organizations have known how to integrate or even deal with. This brings to mind that parallel to the art system that we know, there are non-institutional artistic expressions that constitute separate communities of interest and communities of meaning. And we use this term a lot, not just affinity groups, but also communities of meaning. And these groups somehow establish a distinction between, and confound and reverse the definitions between art as a realm of experience and culture. And we begin to see that the two sometimes function separately and in relationship to each other, but art referring to a specific realm of skills and skilled people, and culture referring to meaning and beauty in everyday life choices. What are these expressions? Well, for the most part, they are drumming circles, community gardens, sewing co-ops, scrapbook parties, a lot of things that normally would have fallen before into hobbies, avocational activities, digital video, of course, many of the things that have been talked about here, quilting circles, music jams of people who just get together to play a drum, not because they are going to be in any group performing, bloggers, cooking, and so forth. Who are these people who do these things? Well, mostly ethnic communities tend to be the primary participant, folk groups, and by that we also refer to any kind of group that comes together as an association. Affinity groups, inventive individuals. There's always been the phenomenon of outsider arts has been explored for a long time, as the eccentrics who will just decorate their gardens with all kinds of found objects and artifacts and usually be a pain for their neighbors. But these are social gatherings, like social dance events, neighborhood projects, commercial ventures also. Where do they meet? Well, for the most part, these groups meet in neighborhood centers, community colleges, in libraries. Libraries are really, really important. And in the United States, at least, they have become the new community centers. Since funding has dried up for a lot of independent small units, libraries have become real places of public sphere, democracy, interaction, conversation, also where a lot of poor people have access to the internet to search for jobs or just to be on Facebook. Church basements and coffee houses, public buildings, that sort of thing. In other words, non-art spaces. And there's been quite a bit of research done on these dimensions. I will talk a little bit later about that. And what it brings to mind is the fact that people engage more as direct producers of art in all of these activities rather than as audiences for our programs. So if you think about the sewing circle by ladies at the church, it usually is you are actually sewing. You're not just watching beautiful garments produced in parade. If you are in the drumming circle, you're actually an amateur, sort of you fancy yourself as some sort of drummer for the weekend. And that always involves some participatory element. And there's a lot of names associated with this. These are some of the ones that have appeared in research. Just a sample. Amateur came up, semi-professional, self-taught, folk artists, and so forth and so on. In general, what we have is a group with some characteristics such as, oh, I should have done this. Hands-on, casually organized. Are they appearing? Yeah. They tend to be sharing groups. They usually connect leisure and work. They are usually also temporary. They don't last, therefore it becomes very difficult for arts organization to be able to stick onto a project for a long time. In contrast to that is the art model, and the art model, and I will go over this very quickly. The space is publicly labeled as an art space. Artists usually have some sort of formal instructions. There are always paid administrators and gatekeepers. Their formalized financing systems is, I cannot tell you how many times I have had to explain to a group of workers in Los Angeles who have a theater company. They are day workers. They just get themselves hired for the day to work in projects and construction and gardening and that sort of thing, but they have a theater group, and I have had to work with them and explaining to them the system of financing for getting a grant. It's a very complicated thing, not because they don't understand it in their capacity, but because it is such a foreign and unique, and I think we forget how used we are to certain terms and terminology and assumptions that go along with what we take for granted in our business. There's a whole administration culture that has been come along with these kind of operations. Bill Ivey, the former chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, has spoken about this in the United States, specifically saying that there's a major crisis because while the art world, this funding system of institutions, have always been proclaiming for the last 30 years that there is a crisis in arts participation, most people have continued to buy their CDs and download their music and through their iPods and buy their CDs even from Starbucks collections. And there's an engagement with an aesthetics that you bring into the working class home that has eluded many of the arts funders in that way. And sometimes it is a theater, and sometimes it's a museum or a nonprofit organizations, but most of the time, really, it has to do with getting your artistic fix somewhere else. And in this regards, it's important to know then that there's been a little bit of a confusion. In the art world, most arts programs are under the banner of outreach. And outreach has usually indicated that to be an active art patron means that you buy tickets and you sit on a chair. Or you walk through a museum. That's as active as you will get. You can't walk very fast in a museum, so it's not very aerobic. So that's being considered the active patron. Writes a check, buys a ticket, goes to the play regularly, and the season subscriber. And the passive is the one that stays at home. And that has been a model that has underwritten the assumptions of most grants applications written in the name of outreach. However, there's perhaps a different way of thinking about it, in that perhaps buying a ticket and sitting in an audience or walking through a museum or buying art are quite passive activities, whereas there's a whole universe in which taking photos, uploading them, creating web pages, making digital movies, playing games on the internet, taking cooking classes, singing at karaoke bars, and all of these type of things are very active artistic endeavors. And perhaps this brings us to question whether the phenomenon of the nonprofit sector was really a 20th century, middle of the 20th century phenomenon that was an anomaly of how most people engage in artistic practice. And yet, because we are kind of living in that particular moment, we think it's it. It may not be at all. The lion's share of public subsidy for arts and culture has supported these platforms for passive participation. For example, in major cities, the majority of the large amounts of money and millions of dollars have gone to building large performance centers and large institutions. In contrast, there's another economy, some people call it the weak economics, of open source and micro community gatherings, the coffee shops where the actual entrepreneur is taking the risk of providing, and those people don't necessarily get the millions of dollars that are spent on arts infrastructures in many of our cities. Which brings us to how many counterintuitive propositions are at stake here. My particular research that I did to generate some of these thoughts was done in Silicon Valley, in San Jose area, Palo Alto area, where 55% of the residents there describe themselves as active art makers in some way. However, most of the major institutions were really suffering. There was a real contradiction. In Silicon Valley, sales of classical music CDs were really, really high, and the classical music station, radio station, had a large listenership, but the symphony was going broke. Studies revealed that actually 51% of people consider themselves that they were an artist. If asked, did you consider yourself an artist, more than half of the population said, yeah, sure, I'm an artist. So this led some people to think about an ecology of the arts that, of course, is more based on assets rather than on deficits. And to make this an assumption of your programming really alters significantly the way that you will go about it. Now, this is my images to represent romantic populism. Don't you love them? They're actually taken from a watercolor class that was taught at one of the local hobby places, locations. Not so fast. I mean, it sounds from what I'm saying that there is indeed a revolution of folk culture just taking over the world and everything is good. And that is true, but it's not so good in the sense that you have real complicated issues of institutional benefits and infrastructure and interdependence, primarily a structure of hierarchical distribution of resources that keeps some of these things. And the people who are very invested in keeping these institutions of arts with walls and with admission counters and with surveys and with all of, well, they have jobs. So it's also a thing related to employment. And we often forget how much employment drives some of these things. In Silicon Valley, perhaps like Montreal, and others can talk about it, it was a good place to tease some of these tensions out for the same reasons that I imagine it would be done here in Montreal. There's a real creative economic culture, creativity. There's a solid arts infrastructure. There was a real abundant mix of unconventional art makers throughout, and you can tell us all about that in Montreal. And then there were also gaps, however, as I mentioned before. So the study really was an ethnographic study, and really ethnography, it allows us an access to these experiences in a way that other ways just don't get there. Participant observation, is immersion with these groups, is interaction, is dancing, is eating the foods, is participating. And I was also interested in looking not at individual cases of exotic mavericks, but also groups that somehow wanted to have a role in the public sphere, which we can go back to that later, as the classic definition of cultural citizenship is that. It's just, you do want to be recognized, you do want to be seen and noticed. So there were many other studies that preceded this, and I don't have time to talk about that. The RAND Corporation read a study, and I think, Jennifer, you talked about those things, and in San Jose there were other studies that have been done before. But in general, the questions were really three: questions of meaning, what was the experience like, questions of mechanism, and questions of mobility. What was the relationship, if there was any relationship at all between these two groups, the informal and the formal. And of course, I found out that there was quite a bit group around two major concepts: cultural democracy, and that involved a lot of the hip hop and spoken words groups that are really being present and being organized and having occupying space. Many of the Mexican folk dances also, even in places like Arizona where it's completely suspect to be Mexican, in this day and time, and you see the proliferation of families bringing kids to their Mexican folkloric dance as an opportunity to meet other families and the kids to have some activity. Women knitting collectives, making do was the second concept. In other words, we don't have a lot of money, a lot of capital, but we will do it anyway. We'll do it. A Vietnamese restaurant that was turned into a gallery for emerging Vietnamese artists. So they will hold a reception at this restaurant once a month. A lesbian poetry group, and I include that also because of the different sexual communities and sexual minorities that are sometimes also a subgroup even within ethnic and immigrant communities that are seeking for ways of affirming their identities. And coffee houses, a series of playing music, inviting musicians, and that sort of thing. In general, there were questions that emerged about the infrastructure that was present there. They were definitely dispersed. It was really hard to grab. One thing existed for 5 months, and then you went back and checked, and it was all over different places of the city. It was very idiosyncratic, usually led by some leader, an organizer, a charismatic persona that brought everybody together. And they were very entrepreneurial. It was somebody who said, it's going to cost me $100 to get the equipment, and if I just charge $10 and 10 people come, I will cover the cost. That sort of idea that was very much like, let's make it happen somehow. And it also led to some people getting into debt with their credit cards and that sort of thing. It was also manifested in commercial ventures. This is a business, a photograph of a place called Petroglyph Ceramic Lounge, where these places are starting to become popular, where you can bring your kids and your family and your cousins and your girlfriends and have a ceramic session where you paint and then they fire the piece there. And these sort of commercial ventures are also tapping into that desire of sort of maverick creativity. I also found that there were corporations in Silicon Valley that were doing these things. For example, Syntex Corporation had an annual employee art show. Hewlett-Packard has its own symphony. It's called the HP Symphony. And they have a website, in their website, of the official website of the company, they call it the HP Way to Play, encouraging employees. They have, Stanford University has many programs for employees. These are all classic Silicon Valley companies and institutions. And of course, Craigslist, which is a social gathering place, which has then a section called groups. And in groups, there were any times about 600 hits per second about people connecting with groups. And many groups were related to computers themselves. Mac users had a users group that met on Tuesdays, and people who were working with Photoshop met on Wednesdays at the usual bookstore. And of course, the largest Silicon Valley company there, Adobe Systems, which by the time I did this research about 5 years ago, already had sold about 500 million copies of Acrobat. And there was a sense of participation that was really running while not a relationship with the established art world. And what I noticed was that many of the informal artists, even immigrants that had arrived recently, were picking up many of the same ideologies that were prevalent in Silicon Valley companies. Immigrants are very studious about where they're going, and they know where they are located. And so there were people who had admiration for the big companies like Hewlett-Packard and Apple, and they were in Silicon Valley, and they would also be the janitors and employees at many of these companies. And some of those things were the distrust of institutions and all social systems. Of course, most immigrants are coming from places where they are rejecting sort of social institutions and dynamics that were not so good for them. But Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, billionaires, also had the same attitudes of distrust for institutions. That's where they were not that interested in the symphony, really, in saving the symphony with their millions. They'd rather be interested that people buy GarageBand and make their own videos and play their own music. A maverick sensibility, in a sense, and shining away from social relations that were highbrow. Many of the entrepreneurs, of course, Google is notorious for this in Silicon Valley. You have sort of, you want to wear sneakers and you want to dress very casual. You don't want to go dressed up to the museum reception. That's not something that interests you. So all of this interesting correlation of the integration between work and play, and a philosophy of personal development that went along with that. That if I do this for myself, it will be good for me. It will somehow help me relax, help me unwind a little bit from the very stressful jobs and that sort of thing. And that being an amateur was part of the fun. You didn't do it to be an expert. You don't necessarily hope to make a living, but it's part of what you do for fun. And in fact, what were the conclusions? Well, there's a few things that I'd like to then close by saying. Developing organizations is not the same as developing participation. I found that if you wanted to develop participation, you had to be very intentional about developing participation. And it had sometimes nothing to do with developing your art institution. Because the art institution, like I said, had demands that had to be met. You had obligations you had taken, employees, health insurance, you had different things that you had to attend to. If you wanted to develop participation, you had to be specific and intentional about that. And most people, of course, wrote a grant to develop participation. It's kind of the vicious circle. The other conclusion was that most of the informal artists, they were toying with the idea of formalizing. So I would talk to the hip hop guys that were organizing spoken word things at a garage and bringing some house music, but they were always saying to me, should I become a nonprofit organization? Should I really get formalized? Because I hear that I can maybe get a grant. Is that the way to go? But there was an ambivalence, but there was also the desire to maybe participate. So there was a lot of that coming along. Audience development, for the most part, always gets off on the wrong premise. It's just something that this notion of the outreach is so outdated, and it is something that people are not responding. It hasn't really worked very well for decades now to have a program where you want to bring people in from the neighborhood that have no relationship to what you're doing in that. You have to transform the institution in order to make that happen. The questions of social distinctions and hierarchies are absolutely central. You have to, and there's some interesting politics there about bringing lowriders to the museum, lowrider cars and decorated. These are people of a certain community, socioeconomic status. So there's always issues of outreach that compromise questions of exhibitionism and a little bit of that self-serving. So it has to be very authentic and genuine. These approaches, they cannot just be come dressed up in your Mexican costume and dance around our guacamole for our Frida Kahlo exhibit. And you'll be surprised, but these are the kind of things that people are very fed up with, they're not interested, and they turn away. What else? Informal arts, however, informal artists were always in admiration of formal artists. If you really are an amateur guitarist and you love to play guitar in your private time, there's nothing that you love more than to be able to spend some time with a real professional guitarist. If you are a photographer and you ever get the chance to be in a workshop with a world-class famous photographer, that's like heaven. And the same for writers. There's so many writers who are signing up crazy when the famous writer comes to town. So you see that there's a lot of interest in the relationship. People were in admiration of artists who had actually developed. Of course, many immigrant parents, when their kids would tell them, I would go to the university to study art, they were very worried. And it was not because they didn't want to become artists, but because they thought that, how are you going to make a living? Because economic survival was really primary for many families. And many nonprofit organizations were already blazing the path in participation, but nobody was paying attention because they tended to be ethnic organizations themselves and smaller organizations. So the museum will get a lot of money to organize an outreach campaign that really was going nowhere, that it was just repeat more of the same, but yet there was a small organization 2 blocks down who was actually doing participatory activities, bringing people for dances, for art making, and they were not receiving the support, so there was that imbalance too. And many people, and I think this was mentioned earlier, have moved to the question of, are we really interested in increasing our participation, or is it better to talk about cultural vitality? And the question of cultural vitality is really interesting for policymakers and planners, urban planners, because really it addresses a lot of the questions related to that earlier point I made about non-art spaces. So who cares how many people? The museum should have the supporters that it has. The symphony should have the supporters that it does. But are there enough parks in our community? Are there enough play yards for kids in the poor neighborhoods? Are there enough spaces where people can cook at a community kitchen that is officially and sanctioned by all the laws of hygiene and all of that, so that you can sell your tamales out in the neighborhood church street parking lot? These sort of things had more to do with cultural vitality of a city than if people were actually participating and being measured by the standards of attendance and buying tickets and that sort of thing. And that research has been led a lot by Maria Rosario Jackson at the Urban Institute. You can go to their websites and download. So I want to talk about that point of vitality, because it's a different question. It's really a question of infrastructure and planning. And in Mexican families in California and in all of the Southwest, if you have a park, you will have a party. But if there's no parks and no green areas and no safe places for the kids to run, it will be very difficult then. So the question really becomes, do we build a museum, or do we build a really nice park with nice benches and barbecue pits? And finally, to conclude, I made some recommendations after my research, convening a learning community of participatory arts, maybe out of this conference. There's a few people who really want to think deeply about this, and they continue to meet and talk informally also, sustaining themselves as a learning community. Codify the practices, in other words, list them, acknowledge them, include them as part of this sort of vision of any cultural plan. Think about, when you think about the cultural plan for your city, think about things like parks and libraries and this sort of activities. Think about investing in buying equipment, for example, so that young aspiring artists can have access to a recording studio. But provide the infrastructure so they don't have to rent it and they don't have to go through the capitalization that it requires to have that kind of professional equipment. So codify that in that sense. And the last one, capitalize on exemplary models. And none of these recommendations were really followed by anybody in the city where I did my research. So I don't know, but I have you here as a captive audience now, so I get to preach the gospel again to you. The other ones is cultivating an ethic of participation, like I said. It's something you have to really put up front. If you kind of forget and put it in the back of your mind, it will never happen. It's easier. Democracy is very messy, and it's difficult. I myself make the decisions myself sometimes. I'm not very democratic about some things. But there are things when I'm in community and I'm working with communities of immigrants, I have to remember that it's more important the process and the democratic approach, even though it's very inefficient sometimes. And there's a part of me that thinks this is crazy, but it's an ethic that you practice. It's not something that comes easy to you. And to that effect, we need to develop the technologies of participation. I think in one of the translations, I don't know what the French word was used in a previous presentation, was talking about equipment, but I don't know if that was just the translation. Well, that's kind of what I'm talking about. You have to have that infrastructure, and those technologies of participation have to be abetted by particular objects and artifacts and places and policies. And finally, the question of asking yourself as often as possible, if this is something that really interests you, whom do we make art for, and with whom and among whom are we making it? And I think that with that intentionality, we get a little bit closer to breaking down this mysterious subject. Thank you very much.